framework and methodology has always been open to a more agile approach. It's been even more explicitly mentioned now, and there are, specifically mentioning on how to incorporate agile ways of delivering as part of the PRINCE2 framework. So the framework can still be used as an overall, perhaps top-directed approach, but still have the ability to deliver quickly and also control rapid changes. One of the last thing that has been part of the considerations of the updating of the manual has been what they call the interconnectedness. It's a weird word. What it covers is that you see in businesses that different business areas and different parts of the company are increasingly being connected, and the impact of changing one bit might be huge in other bits of the business, even though it's not necessarily visible. So making sure dependencies are covered, making sure that projects can be connected easily across, for instance, program or portfolios, have also been quite a significant background to the update. So these are the sort of like high-level aspects, and I'll dive into some of the more specifics. Perhaps specifically, I'll try to in this webinar to focus a bit in on the people part of this. So the new version of the PRINCE2 have 5 integrated elements. The project context is basically the environment where the project happens. That includes the organizational context. It could be the funding context. It could be stakeholder context. So this is, basically what are the surroundings and what do we need to take into account when we design and run the project. Some of you know that I've been working quite a lot in Greenland, for instance, and in the Greenlandic context, there are some issues with transporting goods in the winter. So obviously that places the projects in a very specific context, namely that if you are in need of construction materials, you need to have them delivered before winter sets in. That's a prerequisite for the project, something you need to understand before you design your project timetables and things like that. So that's basically the project context. I'll dive a bit deeper into each of these areas. Then there's the processes, and the processes have more or less stayed the same since at least 2015 in PRINCE2. So it's not that, what can be said about that is that the process design seems pretty solid and also quite flexible in the sense that it can incorporate many ways of doing things. They are high-level processes, and they allow for many different ways of doing the sub-processes, like, for instance, incorporating agile ways of working or adapting into a bigger program environment and things like that. So the processes are more or less the same as they've been up until now. The same goes for the principles. The principles are there not to be literally taken into account, but more like a mindset on how do you do projects. So, and I'll come back to that when we discuss the real life experiences with PRINCE2. If you take the principles too literally, you'll end up having either over-administered or under-administered projects. So it's important to understand what is actually the meaning, the purpose of these principles, and I'll dive into those as well. And then there's the practices, as mentioned previously, called themes, now rewritten to be more directional and more giving advice on how to do stuff rather than just telling what needs to be done. I think that's a really big step forward, because it now turns from a sort of like a book into a more guideline for how to do stuff, and I think that's a big step forward. In the center of all is the people aspect, and the people aspect is the new part of this, and it's integrated in the way that every time you design something, either a plan or a plan is obviously involving people, but also business case and things like that, you consider the people aspect, both in terms of how do we manage these things, how do we manage the change that hits people after the delivery, and how do we manage the stakeholders that are already inside the project. So stakeholders have always been a part of Prince2. The new thing here is that it's trying to embrace also all the change, all the people that are hit by change and affected by the projects after delivery. That's actually a new aspect in Prince2. And also the whole change management. How do you prepare a good transition from project environment into a business as usual environment? So the five sort of like key cornerstones in the project context are the organizational context, also understand the way of delivering things, and again, as you can see here, even in the context discussions, there are clear guidelines on you need to understand what is the best way of deliver things. So while I know that Prince2 has sort of like been labeled as a waterfall methodology, it's actually not true. The waterfall methodology is partly true in the sense that it's based on phases and stages, but the delivery method underneath can easily adopt to both waterfall-based delivery methods, but also agile and hybrid methods. So Prince2 aims to be a framework that can incorporate many different ways of working and sort of like be a common denominator, a unifier that collects different methodologies, different approaches into one consistent and coherent reporting framework. Obviously, there's a big focus on scale. Prince2 have always been a model that can be used on small projects and larger projects, but it takes some brain power to deliberately design whether you are designing the whole framework for a small or a large project. This is where under and over administration is a really real issue that you need to consider. If you took Prince2 by the book and implemented all the management products and all processes and everything by the book, you will most likely end up with a very heavily over-administered project. So that's not a good idea. So scaling is an integrated part. It's actually one of the principles. You need to make sure that the use of the method fits the project context, the organizational context, and the scope of the project in totality. A new thing that is being more predominantly now is the commercial context. So that's recognizing that a lot of projects has different stakeholders, and some of them are actually contractually bound to each other. So even though the methodology says we should be able to stop at a certain stage, that might actually not be something we can do because of commercial context. So the commercial context is now also more integrated. Again, it places more emphasis on how to and being more realistic rather than more heavy on the theory part. And then, of course, as mentioned, the whole sustainability part is also integrated in the project context. Prince2, as it always has been, is focusing in on there are someone who is able to specify what they need. In Prince2, they are called users. I would say users is a broad term. That there are many ways to describe them, but overall, they are the ones that have something they want done. The supplier, again, do not confuse that with necessarily, it's not necessarily a commercial supplier, it could be an internal supplier, but this is someone who delivers. One of the misconceptions I often encounter when doing Prince2 training is that, but if you have a supplier, you're a supplier for life. That's actually not the case. You might in one stage be represented as a user. You specify your needs, and in a later stage you might actually enter the project as a supplier. So remember, the roles are key in Prince2, not the people or the persons by themselves. The roles are the ones that we shuffle around. The person assume roles and do that on behalf of a role, so deliver on behalf of a role. And that can change all along. So that's part of the flexibility in the Prince2 methodology, that different people can assume different roles during the project's lifetime. Then, of course, the third role, which is the really important one, is of course the business. And the idea here is that someone needs to pay for all this, and that's represented by the business, meaning also that this is where the mandate resides, and also the structure for how do we do things, the governance structure. The governance and its alignment with the business has also been emphasized a bit more here in version 7. Delivery methods, I've already been through this. In PRINCE2, in the new version here, we operate with 3 different delivery methods. It's not that the project as a totality needs to settle on one of these 3 delivery methods. It's actually stated that these are different approaches you can use, and you can use, perhaps 2 teams are working on a linear approach, so the more stage-gated approach. 5 other teams are working on the more agile, the iterative incremental approach, and 1 team could use the hybrid. So you can mix a lot of different delivery methods, and PRINCE2 aims to provide a sort of like a common interface that whatever your way of working is, you will have an interface to the overall project, the business case, the structure and governance around risks and issue handling and things like that. So the idea is choose whatever method is most appropriate, fits the organization, fits the team, use that as you would always use it, and make sure, and PRINCE2 would then make sure that you can actually work the way you're used to and still have an interface to the larger scope of the project. In the people aspect in PRINCE2, it covers, of course, those who are working on the project, but also those affected by the project. And those affected by the project have always been mentioned in the PRINCE2 terminology, but only as a sort of like a big group of people that somehow at the end of it all will be affected by your project. Now it's taking into the methodology not only as someone who's being affected by, but also with some advice on and some theory around how to deal with change management, how to deal with leadership, how to deal with an ever-changing project environment and organizational environment, all those things. So where if you look at the PMI approach versus the PRINCE2 approach in previous times, PMI were definitely stronger on the people side. I think PRINCE2 has taken a very significant step forward now, a whole chapter dedicated to leadership, change leadership, and project leadership. So I think it's a really interesting step forward, and it also helps to emphasize that it's not about project management as much as it is about project leadership. So the whole, the chapter and all the things that have been included is also to emphasize that the role of the project manager is changing in general. It's expected that the project manager takes on much more leadership and a heavy leadership role, and also is perhaps more self-managed than has been the concept previously. If we take a look at this, people are central to the method. The way it's now explained is that projects are not only about delivering products, it's about leading successful change, it's about leading successful teams, and it's about the ability to communicate clearly and concisely. And in all this, the one central and common thing are the people. And I think most of us that have run projects also recognize that these are, in fact, what we spend most of our time with. The management part, making reporting, making plans and things like that, of course, needs to be there. But it's more like these are tools we use in order to secure that we are leading successful change, that we are leading teams that are being successful, and that we constantly keep ourselves up to speed with communicating with the right people at the right time. So I think it's nothing new, but it's nice to see it actually explicitly mentioned now in the PRINCE2 manual, and also included in the approaches and in the practices and things like that. Principles are more or less the same. It's about ensured continued business justification. This is about the business case. Learn from experience is and has always been a key principle. The defined roles and responsibilities has always been there, and what has been added now is also you need to also define relationships. This is a new one, and this is of course connected to the people part. So it's not only about making roles and responsibilities clear, but also what are the different relationships in the host organization, but also in the project organization between stakeholders, funding partners, things like that. So relationships are now a key word in the PRINCE2 setup. We still manage by stages, which is, of course, leaning PRINCE2 towards a stage-gated model. We also manage by exception, meaning that we trust. So PRINCE2 is basically based on a high level of trust. When we agree to something, we expect the teams and whoever we made the agreement with to actually hold on to that agreement and only communicate if deviations are happening. So we trust, and therefore PRINCE2 is a methodology that is based and built on trust. And of course, that's also placing quite a lot of responsibility on the teams. You cannot just not communicate that you're not on track. You need to be open and transparent. This is something that is also now being addressed very specifically in the leadership chapter. There's still a very sharp focus on the product part. And of course, as mentioned previously, you need to tailor the methodology to suit the project. So these are the principles, more or less the same with few adjustments, for instance, the relationship input. Previously, we had 6 aspects of project performance. The new one here is the sustainability part. As mentioned, sustainability is more predominant now in the version 7. So making sure that everything aligns with, for instance, corporate ESG goals and things like that is a key in all this. So sustainability has now a more predominant and integrated part, and is also because of that one of the aspects of the project performance, along and on equal terms with benefits and risks and costs and the ones that we already know. Practices, as mentioned, practices are the new word. It was called themes before. The practices are rewritten to be more hands-on. And the practices you know are still more or less the same. We have the 7 practices: business case, organizing, plans, quality, risks, issue, and progress. All key aspects of a project that you need to somehow control. The new thing in version 7 here is that it's not only described what you need to control, but also rewritten in a sense to how do you then control this. And I think this slight rewriting of stuff actually helps to give the practices themes, the practices chapters more relevance in terms of how do we use and how do we convert from something that's written in a book to something we need to do in our everyday life. So they're more directional, more guidelines than they've been before. Processes, again, more or less the same. In the Danish version, you'll find a slight rewording on this managing a stage boundary. So that has in Danish will now be called styring and faseovergang, whereas the previous word was ledelse. And managing is the English term for styring, so we simply aligned more to the English version. It's been cooking for a long time. It's almost a religion to some. Now we took the step. We were courageous and took the step now. And I think it's the right time, because it's also giving, even though it's just a word, it actually gives more meaning that it's something you need to manage. It's not a leadership effort you have here. It's a managing effort you have here. But otherwise, the processes are the same. It's about understanding what we do in starting up a project. It's about initiating the project, meaning setting up the right governance structure, not necessarily understanding all the requirements, because this is where it's aligning with an agile mindset, but at least understand what governance structures are there, what is the organizational context, what are the ground rules for funding and budgeting and cost management, things like that. So initiation is basically making sure you have the right foundation for running the project. It's not about knowing everything up front. So in that sense, it's not a stage-gated waterfall-based method. It's more like make sure you have your organizational backing and support before you hit the ground and doing projects. The other part is, these parts, controlling a stage and managing a stage boundary, is very much project managing focus areas, whereas the managing product deliverables is where the interface is to different methodologies like the Agile, Scrum, or SAFe, or whatever you choose to have as a delivery methodology. So the interface to other methodologies is basically this managing product delivery. It's a very simple process, and it allows for whatever you do, fine, but deliver in an agreed context, format, frequency, and the frequency is not necessarily the same across all teams. So one team can have a weekly setup. Other teams might follow the bi-weekly Scrum standard or things like that. So basically, Prince2 tries to make sure that whatever you feel comfortable working with as a delivery method, you can continue to do that because that's the most efficient way of working. And then Prince2 methodology tries to incorporate it in a way so you still maintain the overall control and perspective of the project as a totality. If I take a look at some of my observations from real life using Prince2, one of the things that is really interesting is that good practice is actually not a skill or a tool set. It's much more a matter of a mindset. So even though Prince2, the manual, has a lot of tools provided, it's called techniques in Prince2, it does actually also via the principles try to describe a certain mindset. And that's why I think the principles are actually quite interesting and quite relevant to understand, not necessarily word by word, but what lies behind and how could that be a mindset in our organization. And if not possible, what is then preventing us from incorporating the mindset into the project? So I think, to me, good project management using Prince2 is not using the book as is and take it too literally, but more like trying to adopt the mindset of Prince2, making sure that use the methodology you're most convenient for you and you're most used to, and try to incorporate that into, so you respect people's way of working and try to build that together into something that is coherent when you report and have the overall view of the project. So mindset is quite important. Another key observation is creating the level playing field of common understanding. This is tied a bit into item 4 on this list, the common language. I often see people trying or using terminology directly from the manual. It can be done, of course, but it also alienates things sometimes. So in order to make sure that you actually work based on Prince2, do not use all the words in Prince2 because they're so alien to some people. So come up with new words, or use the words that are already used in the organization, and make your own connections into the manual. I think one of the mistakes often seen in using Prince2 is you try to adopt the terminology of Prince2 as is, but what you really want to adopt is the mindset rather than the terminology. And instead of creating a common and level playing field, you actually alienate all the people that do not have a deep understanding of Prince2. So creating this level playing field is something I really always try to do as a project manager. I know my Prince2, that's fine, but I don't require everyone else to understand the details of Prince2. Instead, I wanted to work according to a different mind or a certain mindset. Clear principles are a key to success, and with that, my observation is that a good thing at the beginning of every project is to repeat and revisit the principles, not because they change, they don't, but because different project teams have different interpretation of what these principles actually are. So I always find it a very, very good and interesting discussion at a project kickoff to actually discuss, okay, these are some key principles. How do you see these, and what is your understanding of this principle, and how do we actually incorporate that into the project? We almost always end up the same place, but the process of actually discussing principles as part of a project kickoff, to me, is very valuable, because it sets them, it's a mind setting exercise, which is I think is really valuable. The common language, and tied into it does not need to be Prince2, but the common is the important part here, not Prince2 language. The common is important. And one of the things that I almost always also encounter is people say, we will use best practice. Yeah, sounds good. And on paper, it also looks good. But best practice is actually an average. If you look at the book, it's based on inputs from many, many, many projects. And the sum total of all this, someone tried to extract what are the best and key learnings, and we call that best practice. Problem is that most of the projects that I will be, or you will be working at, has not been part of the baseline for that average. So it's an average that does not necessarily cover the exact topics and the exact context of this project. So I'm always careful to just use the phrase, we will use best practice. No, we will use an adopted version of best practice. And I think that's key also for people to understand that best practice is not Prince2. Best practice is what is best for the project in the context that it sits in, using inspiration from Prince2 and perhaps other methodologies as well. So even though it's called best practice, remember, it's just an average. Scaling is important. Over and under administration, I've seen both. Both are terrible, and both will place a lot of workload on the and unnecessarily workload on the project organization. So definitely try to avoid that. It's improved quite a lot in version 7 here, because the number of management products, the templates and stuff, has been actually quite reduced, and they are now also put into the context. So in previous versions of the manual, there was an Appendix A that contained all the templates, and it felt like you needed to have all 60 or 42 or whatever the number was before you ran Prince2. But that's not the case. Now they've actually taken the templates and placed them in the chapter where they are most relevant. So when you read about business case, they also provide you with an idea and inspiration on how do you then structure and write your business case. And again, it gives a much more hands-on approach and a mindset of how do I actually do this rather than what to do. Clear roles and responsibilities are always a prerequisite. And the add-on here in Prince2 version 7 is, of course, that it's not only the roles and responsibilities, it's also the relationship between the people. And I guess most of you will also have, you can nod to this, that you have two stakeholders, but it's not the stakeholders themselves, it's actually that they are in some kind of relationship, either manager, employee, or some sort of a stakeholder that's going on between them. So it's not only managing the two stakeholders individually, it's also managing their relation. And if their relationship is beneficial to the project and the transition and change, maybe you should focus in on how can I improve their relationship? How can I support their existing good relations and things like that? So it takes it a step further down the line in the stakeholder management part. I think that is it from me, and many thanks for listening once again. And of course, if you have any questions and or comments, I'm very open to hearing. And perhaps I forgot one thing before you're allowed to question the status update on the Danish version. We have a team that has been working on translating the UK version, as mentioned, and it's been quite a difficult process for many reasons. Traction is now good, And the original launch date was scheduled to be the 23rd of October. That has now been changed to the week beginning with the 11th of November. The last rounds of reviews we've had, the quality is looking quite good, to be honest. So we are, the SMEs, the subject matter experts, the team that we had looking into the manual, we've been very skeptical and very cautious about mentioning that this will be a good version. But I think actually we have reached the point where we can say we believe in the launch date, and we also believe that the quality of the Danish manual will be quite good. Not only the manual, but of course also the exams and like. I think that's it for my side now.
What would be your best advice before going for the exam? Because what I have noticed is that version 6 have like direct questions, while version 7 have like a scenario-based one.
Yeah.
It's a bit tricky, so if you can just give us some advice.
Yeah. So the best advice I have is, since the scenario-based approach is actually using the scenarios in version 7, you will have the ability to actually read up on the scenarios as they are in the manual. So read the scenarios, and I would say, even though that there are different scenarios, and choose the scenario that is closest to your own business, and perhaps do replicate what the scenario shows, but with your business as the center. So basically trying to convert what you're reading into your own organizational context. I find that this is a good way of really understanding what the scenarios are about, but also how PRINCE2 is applied. Because normally as a student, you battle on at least 3 parameters. You battle on terminology, there's lots of new words and terms that you need to understand. You battle on understanding the actual application of PRINCE2, and you perhaps also battle a bit with understanding the cases. What are the real cases here? And the best way to actually address these issues is to try and make your project in your organization, because then you have a solid ground to basically have your feet on your own organization. You understand your own organization. So take perhaps 1 or 2 scenarios that looks like your organization best and replicate it, but in your project context. I find that to be a very good way of preparing for the exam, actually.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. You're muted, Nikolai.
Well, then I'll just unmute myself. That always helps.
Yes.
No, I was just saying that, well, this will then be all for today, and thank you very much for joining us. We will share the recording of this webinar once, sometimes the next few days. And if there's anything, just you have my email, you just reach out and I will forward questions to Kenny if they are related to the theory-based things about PRINCE2.
Alrighty. Thanks for joining, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye.